Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum, and I'm here today at the British Royal Armouries taking a look at one of the anti-tank rifles in their extensive firearms reference collection. This is a wz.35 Uruguay, is the code name that was given to this rifle, aka a wz.35 Maroszek rifle. This was Poland's standard anti-tank rifle at the beginning of World War II. And it's a gun that has actually a very interesting history to it, and a very diverse use throughout World War II. So before I get started, I do want to throw out a big thanks to my friend, firearms researcher in Poland, Leszek Ehrenfecht, who gave me a tremendous amount of information on this gun. So anything I get wrong in this is on me, but Leszek was extremely generous, and I will repost his full article. It won't fit in the YouTube comments, so I'll put a link over to Forgotten Weapons, my own blog, where you can read his full treatise. Anyway, the story of Poland's anti-tank rifle originates in the late 1920s, when a Major Felstein in Polish service is experimenting with German high-velocity sporting rifles, and comes to the conclusion that this is a possible way to develop a viable anti-tank rifle. Not one that uses a technically complex armor-piercing projectile, but one that's entirely based on velocity, that uses a totally traditional copper-jacketed solid lead bullet, but is able to penetrate armor by virtue of just sheer velocity. In 1931, this project is formally approved or formally enshrined by the Polish military, and they go about starting development. Now, the whole project will remain exceedingly secret throughout the entirety of the 1930s. The different elements of the project were kept separate, so very few people had a full idea of what was going on. In particular, the development of the powder and the cartridge were done separately from the development of the rifle. And now this Major Felstein was the guy in charge of both, and fortunately for the Poles, he was able to juggle both roles pretty effectively and handle the coordination between the rifle and the cartridge. 1932, fairly quickly, there are two rifles that are ready for assessment, testing for the role of anti-tank rifle. One of them is this very complicated, heavy, it's a 16 kilogram, which is going to be something on the order of 35, 40 pounds. Has a hydraulic recoil buffer system. It's heavy, it's complicated. It's not so great. The other is a rifle developed by Józef Maroszek. That's the same Maroszek who developed Poland's 1938 pattern self-loading rifle. He's young, he's clever, he is a bit unorthodox. He had previously developed a new bolt-action carbine, very close, like it was also a 1932 pattern, bolt-action carbine for the Polish Armed Forces, which was not adopted. He took his bolt-action from that rifle and he combined it with, it was a simple bolt action, combined it with a small detachable magazine, a very long barrel, did the calculations and realized, claimed, understood, decided, realized that he could get away with a relatively thin barrel on this thing, and it would still withstand the pressure of firing this very high velocity cartridge. If you compare this to something like a World War I German tank Gewehr, the barrels on those things are huge. They're really big in diameter, and the gun is incredibly heavy as a result. Maroszek's gun, codenamed Uruguay, by the way, just to have lead people away from any idea that it might be an anti-tank rifle. In theory, it was going to be an export gun sent to Uruguay. Anyway, this gun weighs 10 kilos. That's the same as a BAR in service. It's actually a remarkably light, handy gun. I can hold this thing offhand without that much trouble. So Maroszek designs this. At the time that he pretty much finalizes the rifle design, the current iteration of the cartridge is a 7.92 millimeter, so standard 7.92 Mauser bullet diameter by 86 millimeter long. So that's a pretty darn long cartridge. Regular 8 millimeter Mauser is a 57 millimeter cartridge. This is about half again longer. And that was able to defeat a 20 millimeter thick armor plate at 100 yards. And the mechanism that was used here, again, this is a simple lead core jacketed bullet. What the Poles found is at high enough velocity, the bullet would essentially vaporize itself, meld itself into the armor plate, but the energy transfer would knock a plug of armor out of that plate and ricochet it around inside the vehicle. with significant wounding capability. So, some of these tests, we're talking, you hit a 20 millimeter thick piece of plate steel, that's about 0.8 inches, a little over 3/4 of an inch. It would create a 1 inch in diameter plug of armor that goes shooting into the tank, bouncing around, breaking stuff and hurting people. So this was a unintuitively, surprisingly effective anti-armor system. And there's enough testing that went on at the time that this was a quite real effect, which would be a surprise to the Germans, who still didn't believe it even after they captured the rifles, but we'll get to that in a couple minutes. Now, even after the rifle design is basically finalized in 32, development of the cartridge continues. And the biggest problem they had with this initial early version of the cartridge was that it was incredibly corrosive on barrels. The gun had a barrel life, a service life of 60 to 70 rounds, which is like really, really short. This thing was burning out barrels incredibly quickly. So the initial plans to order the guns, they figured we want to have a service load of about 200 rounds of ammunition for guys to be able to shoot. So they plan to issue a gun, every gun, with 3 spare barrels. And the barrel it's not a quick change barrel, but it is an easily changed barrel. There's a fairly simple set of tools. They're flats, you'll see them in a minute, on the barrel. Turn off the barrel, put on a new barrel. The sights are mounted on the barrel itself, so each barrel was zeroed. You didn't have to worry about re-zeroing the gun after you put a new barrel on it. And that's how they were going to give this gun the service lifespan that they deemed necessary. Now, by 1934, they have redesigned, essentially they've developed a new powder formulation that is a lot gentler on the barrels. They've also significantly extended the cartridge. They went from an 86 millimeter case to a 107 millimeter case. This thing almost looks like some sort of practical joke of a cartridge case. And this becomes the final version. This thing has a muzzle velocity of approximately 4,200 feet per second, firing a 198 grain bullet. It is extremely high velocity. High enough, again, that it can punch through basically the armor of all of the very early war, the Blitzkrieg era German armored vehicles. The Panzer Is and Panzer IIs were in fact vulnerable to this cartridge, and a significant number of them took damage, took hits, and were potentially knocked out by these rifles during the German invasion of Poland. With this new powder and cartridge developed, the design of the gun is tweaked a little bit. None of the guns have actually been manufactured or delivered yet. They extend the barrel. It had been a 1 meter barrel. They extend that to 1.2 meters. That's a 47-inch long barrel, which is why I have to set up the camera like this, with that thing going way out on the side. The barrel life is now extended to between 250 and 300 rounds, which is great, because that means the standard service load that they're going to issue guys in the field of 200 cartridges, you can do that all in one barrel. So instead of issuing every gun with 3 spare barrels, they now take that 3 spare barrel sort of unit, the transit case with the spares, that becomes a company level item. And instead, what they're going to do is they're going to issue, in the first phase of deployment, they're going to issue 1 rifle to every platoon of soldiers. That would be then 3 to the company. And then the company also gets a set of spare barrels. So standard procedure here was after 200 rounds fired, you would automatically swap out the barrel to a new one. Then there will be a second phase of deployment. Once they've gotten everyone, the whole army equipped with 1 per company, they'll then continue manufacturing and issuing out the guns until they have 3 per company. So ultimately this means about 7,600 guns in the first phase, with a grand total of just over 20,000 to fully meet the deployment plan. Now, I mentioned earlier these guns were being kept secret, not just during the development, but also during the issuing, like during the manufacturing of these guns. They're all packed in crates. You've got a crate with ammunition, you've got a crate with the rifle, you've got a crate with the spare barrels. And they're all marked as various types of surveying equipment to keep things quiet. They're sealed, they're held in central depots. And the plan is, when people are kind of sure that a war is coming, they will issue out, there'll be an order that goes out for guys to familiarize themselves with the guns. And that happens in July of 1939. Germany's looking pretty sketchy over there. Russia's looking pretty sketchy over there. The order goes out, do the familiarization training. And there's I should note here, there's sort of not an urban myth so much, but a general understanding or belief that the secrecy around these guns was part of what led to them being ineffective, because guys didn't know what to do with them. Well, as Leszek puts it, he makes a convincing argument here. When the guns were sent out for familiarization, each company was to take its 3 best marksmen, the best marksmen from every platoon. And these are guys whose standard issue weapon is a Mauser, a wz.39 Polish Mauser, which works the exact same way as one of these. It's just a bolt action. They're the best shots, and they're given a couple hours and a few demonstration familiarization shots with the rifle to understand what is this. We'll read through the manual, figure out how are we supposed to use it, what do we do with it. Okay, this exists. Let's start thinking about using this in our deployment and our planning and our tactics. It's not going to be that hard for the best marksman with a Mauser rifle to figure out how to use what is essentially a big Mauser rifle. The recoil is, of course, more than a service cartridge, but that muzzle brake did a fantastic job of taming the recoil on these rifles, and they probably recoiled less than big bore hunting rifles of the time. So this wouldn't have been that much of a challenge for guys to get used to and to understand. So anyway, when they deploy, or when they familiarize, each shooter gets a couple of rounds. The armorers for each company then change out the barrels on each of the guns, so they have a nice fresh barrel in them, and that familiarizes the armorer with the process of changing out the barrels. And then they get packed up and resealed. All the spent brass goes back into the case, so there's no evidence. They don't want Germany or anyone else finding out that this is part of their standard infantry armament, lest the Germans up-armor their tanks before they invade, which, by the way, they did up-armor those tanks after the invasion. Had they done it before, they could have blunted a lot of the effect that these rifles did have. Anyway, there will then be a subsequent order to actually issue out the rifles. Like, war is here, oh crap, send out the anti-tank rifles. And that order comes on the night of August 28 to 29, 1939. And that's when these rifles go out into the field and start seeing active service. So we'll talk about what they did during the war and after, but first let's take a closer look at the details. There aren't a lot, but at the details of Maroszek's wz.35. All right, so here's the main working bits of the gun. First off, there are virtually no receiver markings. Now, the whole project is being kept pretty secret, so why bother writing a bunch of stuff on the gun? We have a bore diameter, we have a serial number, we have some proof marks, but that's pretty much it. I will note this seam right here is the boundary between the receiver and the barrel. That'll become more important in a minute. We have a pretty basic bolt action system, 90-degree bolt throw, opens all the way up. We do have a detachable box magazine here, which I believe held 3 rounds with 2 release tabs. So you push them both, you can slide this out. That is your standard cartridge. So that's going to go in here, slide all the way back. I can pull the trigger and pull the bolt out. We have 2 primary locking lugs, gas vent holes, important. 1 additional safety lug back here. That's your sear. And this has a safety lockout system, much like one of the Swiss Schmidt-Rubin rifles. So if we put this back in the gun, I can cock it like that, and then I can render it safe by rotating the firing pin, the striker, off to the side, where now the trigger does nothing. And to recock it, I just pull this back, rotate it down, and the gun's ready to go. The rear sight here is a very simple fixed rear notch. It is zeroed for 200 meters. The Poles figured that was about the maximum effective range of the armor penetrating capability of the cartridge. Obviously, if you're just shooting at targets, you can go a lot farther, but this wasn't for recreational shooting. This was for tanks and armored vehicles. And beyond 200, there just wasn't going to be enough punch in the cartridge to get through the armor. Furthermore, there was no need to have adjustable sights because with a muzzle velocity of over 4,000 feet per second, this thing is essentially just a giant laser beam. No holdovers required at any range. In that way, it's actually an easier gun to shoot than a regular bolt-action 8mm Mauser. We have a folding bipod here that locks up around the barrel. To unlock that, I'm just going to unhook that guy. The bipod then folds out. This is very similar to early BAR bipods. We have a crossbar in the middle that locks in place. You've got some pivot to the bipod. You've also got some rotation to it. Seems fine. A little bit flimsy maybe, but the barrel on these is actually fairly light. and I think that bipod is probably perfectly serviceable. Really, the only other significant feature here is this muzzle brake. We do have another Polish proof mark there, but we have a basic square front sight and a 2 horizontal chamber, or a 1 chamber, 2 vent, big muzzle brake there on the front. And this allegedly did an extremely good job of controlling recoil, something like a 60% recoil reduction compared to what was felt if you didn't have this on the gun. There really isn't much disassembly to do here, but we will pull this apart so you can see what the armorers would have been doing changing the barrels. First off, I have loosened the screw on the front band here so that we can slide this forward. There we go, far enough that we can remove the upper handguard. We then have 2 action screws, one here at the front of the trigger guard, one here at the back of the receiver, and I've already loosened those up. So we can pull those out. That allows me to remove the trigger guard assembly here. You can see both of the magazine catches, front and rear. And we can then slide the stock off the gun. And there is a reinforcing box. That's what holds the magazine inside. As for the stock, the rest of the stock, not really a whole lot going on. We do have a recoil lug, which you would expect for the front mounting screw. Everything else there is pretty ordinary. Plain metal butt plate, no trapdoor or anything on here. And then that gives us our receiver and barrel. And you'll notice there are 3 flats machined into the outside of the barrel. So that's where the armorer's wrench essentially would go to be able to unscrew the barrel. This, by the way, is just a handguard retainer that slides off. So the barrel is going to come unscrewed here. You can see we have some alignment marks on it right there. One point of interest here, there are 2 different serial numbers on the gun. There's a serial number on every receiver, and there's also a serial number on every barrel. And they were not intended to be matched. The rifles and barrels were serial numbered in independent ranges, and that was largely because barrel life was very closely watched. You know, barrel life was really important to the application of these guns, and there were spare barrels that were issued in the field. So we don't know exactly how many of the Maroszeks were actually manufactured, but we have a pretty good idea that the first phase of deployment was fully met. The highest serial number documented today is gun number 6588. That's in the Polish Army Museum in Warsaw. The highest serial numbered barrel that's known is in the 15,000 range. So this particular one is about halfway through gun production and actually relatively early, there it is, barrel production. Barrel number is 4,200 and change. As you can see, overall, not a particularly complex gun. There's definitely going to be some expense, certainly in the barrel. They wanted to make these quite well, good fit and finish to them. The final cost for the Maroszeks for the wz.35 was 1,000 zloty per gun. To put that in some context, a Polish BAR at the time cost the Polish government about 2,000 zloty, and a WZ-29, a bolt-action Mauser carbine, cost them 170. So this is, for the cost of a BAR, you could get 2 of these anti-tank rifles. For the cost of one of these anti-tank rifles, you could get just about 6 standard Mauser carbines. Unfortunately for the Poles, even having a pretty good anti-tank rifle was not enough to let them withstand the German blitzkrieg. And of course, Poland falls. Doesn't help that Russia invades them from the other side at the same time. These rifles are used in combat. There are pictures out there of Panzer Is and Panzer IIs with guys showing off holes in them from wz.35 Maroszek rifles. The Germans will quite happily capture as many of these as they can get. They end up with 880 guns and 255,000 rounds of ammunition. The Poles actually made quite a lot of ammo for these guns. But they only have 630 barrels. It's a very long, relatively thin barrel, and a lot of the Polish troops who are captured or surrender bend the barrels between tree branches to prevent them from being useful to the Germans. Still, that number captured is, I think, actually more than the Germans had of their own anti-tank rifles, their PZB 38s and 39s, and so the Germans do put these into service and do use them. They're designated the PZB, the Panzerbüchse 35P. They will also, in January of 1941, sell 250 of them to the Italians. The Italians use these things. When Italy signs an armistice later in the war, the Germans will capture some of those sold guns back and continue using them again. What's really interesting to me is the Germans don't trust this solid lead bullet. Poles do, and it seems to have worked well for them, but what the Germans do is actually reload the ammunition with the tungsten-cored projectiles from their own anti-tank rifles. The PZB-39 is also a 7.9 millimeter, 7.92 millimeter bore, and the projectiles can actually be interchanged. So the Germans reload it all. This is actually a German cartridge with a black tip to it. So that's what the Italians and the Germans will use for ammunition, which is, by the way, part of, I think, why there is some confusion online as to what the ammunition really was, because you have Polish records that say lead core, you have German evidence, German ammunition that still exists today that is tungsten core, which is what we think of when what we expect for armor-piercing ammunition. Anyway, that's the explanation for it. Now, some of these rifles were also captured by the Soviet Union during their invasion. We don't really know exactly what happened with them. The Soviets didn't really go on to use those rifles in active service, but they do appear to have had a significant element in inspiration for the Soviet anti-tank rifle program, which would start pretty promptly once Germany turns around and invades Russia. In turn. The muzzle brake on this thing is remarkably similar to that on the Rukavishnikov, which is the very first Soviet anti-tank rifle. Doesn't actually go into service. That muzzle brake's pretty similar as well to the PTRS-41 that does go into service. There's yet another use of these guns. There is a non-trivial number of Polish soldiers who escape over the border into Hungary rather than be captured by the Soviets, which in retrospect was a very good plan. They're interned by the Hungarians. Over time, most of them are allowed to leave through to other friendly allied nations, but the Hungarians keep the guns, in particular the anti-tank rifles. And Hungary will eventually sell these to Finland. Now, Finland didn't really trust 8 millimeter as an anti-tank rifle bore diameter, so the Finns will use these as training rifles, and there are some pictures in the Finnish archives from the Winter War, which is really cool, of Finns with wz.35 Maroszek rifles. Finns will use them as training rifles, and then in the field they're using boys rifles that they get. This is going into the continuation war. They're using Lotties, they're using boys rifles, but they don't generally use these, as far as I can tell, in frontline service. And that's, by the time the continuation war is coming around, most of the vehicles in service are not going to be vulnerable to these anyway. Early in the Winter War they would have been. You'd be looking at, T-26s, that kind of thing. Once KVs and T-34s are in the mix, the T-34 is not really worried about 7.92 by 107. So that is most of, I think that's all of the service history that I am aware of that I can tell you guys about these. They are pretty darn scarce rifles today. There are a number of them still in Poland, but the British Royal Armouries had this example, and I figured this would be a great opportunity to take it out, show it to you guys, and explain its fantastic history. So once again, a big thanks, not just to the British Royal Armouries for access to the gun, but to Leszek for his tremendous amount of information on the gun, allowing me to present it to you guys, hopefully as accurately as possible. I hope you enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching.